Assalamu alaikum and welcome to our 64th edition of our webinar series at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. The Center for Islam and Global Affairs runs a monthly webinar inviting experts from the field to profile their work and to address pertinent issues in current international relations. This week, we are honored to have Dr. David Temin. Dr. Temin is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is also an affiliated faculty member of the Native American Studies program there. He is a political theorist. His research interests and spans American political thought, Native American studies, comparative politics, global political thought, post-colonial theory. His most recent book, which has made waves in the field, Remapping Sovereignty, Decolonization, and Self-Determination in North American Indigenous Political Thought, is the subject of our conversation today. Obviously, this conversation is couched in the current genocide that is taking place against the Palestinians. Over, as of today, more than 10,000 civilians have lost their lives, of whom more than 75% are women and children. The process of occupying and taking over Palestinian land has become almost a suffocating issue for imperialists and their buzzing around the world trying to justify the current occupation. We thought it would be very timely to invite Dr. Temin and for him to draw, to first of all, share with us the conclusions of his recent work, and also give some insights into how, as those of us who are interested in helping the Palestinian cause, how we can think through decolonization and self-determination for Palestinians. Dr. Temin has been widely published in many academic journals. He is currently very active also on Twitter. You can follow him at his handle, David_Temin. I will begin by giving the floor to David to present the arguments from his book, and then we will have a lively discussion afterwards. Those of you who are following us from YouTube, I welcome you, and you can always field your questions via the YouTube app, and we will try our best to address them to our esteemed colleague here. David, the floor is yours. You can present your PowerPoint, and you can begin. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Uweas, for that wonderful introduction. I hope everyone can see I have a little PowerPoint here just to frame some of the initial comments that I'll be making about the book. First of all, I'm really honored. Cannot see my screen, or?
No, we can't. Can you share your screen, please?
Yes. Sure.
There it goes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for telling me. I'm very honored to be here and to get the invitation and be kind of invited into this conversation. I should say that, I'm not an expert on Islamic affairs, on Middle Eastern affairs. And so I feel even more honored to be able to share my work from the vantage point that I'm coming from and learn from you all. But I will try to connect some of what I've done in the book to the current grave crisis that's going on in Gaza and in Israel Palestine. So my presentation today is entitled Remapping Sovereignties, Decolonization from Turtle Island, which is the name that many indigenous peoples here call North America, to Palestine. So I'll just briefly outline my talk, and I won't take up too much time giving the talk. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and to learn from you all, but I'll do three basic things in the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivations and give a bit of a summary of my book, which is called Remapping Sovereignty, Decolonization, and Self-Determination in North American Indigenous Political Thought. It's both a kind of reading and interpretation and history of a series of important thinkers from indigenous societies in North America, sometimes called Native Americans. I refer to them as indigenous peoples as they, and refer to them through their community names, the names of their different communities where possible. And it's also a kind of conceptual argument that tries to bring together this tradition, this very internally diverse and pluralistic tradition of indigenous political thought, in order to make some claims about the way these thinkers have considered questions of decolonization and self-determination, both specific to North America, but also in a kind of broader conversation with global decolonization and the national liberation movements as they developed across earlier in the 20th century, and then as they resulted in various forms of national independence and ongoing struggle against sort of the continuing forms of colonialism, including various modalities of settler colonialism. I'll also talk a little bit, I won't go over all the chapters or figures in the book, but I did want to talk a little bit about one particular figure in the book who is the Stolo poet, Coast Salish poet Lee Marle, who passed away 2 years ago now, and was a longtime activist who really explicitly connected her work originally in the so-called Red Power movement in Canada to the Palestinian struggle, and maintained ties with some with the PLO and Palestinian activists in Canada. So I thought that would be kind of an interesting connection to make as we kind of think through this present moment, and what the implications of those connections might be. So I want to begin by talking a bit about where I started this project, which was back in 2016. And at that time, there was a plan by a corporation to build the Dakota Access Pipeline. This is in North Dakota. The pipeline was slated to run all the way from the Alberta tar sands in Canada, where oil is very, very invasively extracted from the tar sands. And then the pipeline would run all the way across the United States, through North Dakota, and down to the Gulf of Mexico. The pipeline was initially supposed to go through the town of Bismarck, North Dakota, which is predominantly white. And after the citizens of Bismarck said that they didn't want a pipeline to go through their town, they the company redirected the pipeline to go right off of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And this began a series of events, really initiated initially by the Standing Rock Sioux youth who did a march to Washington in protest of the pipeline initially, but which eventually bloomed into a kind of full-blown struggle against the pipeline. People came from all over the United States, even all over the world, to support the Standing Rock Sioux, who are Lakota and Dakota, to protest the construction of the pipeline. And one of the central ways that the people on the ground, there were two camps that they founded to stop the pipeline, the Ochechi camp, which is a name for the name for the Great Sioux Nation, so all of the different Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples, and the Sacred Stone Camp. And the way they articulated what they were doing was by calling themselves water protectors. They called themselves water protectors, and they refused the label of protesters. And so one of my starting points for this project was to try to think through the distinctiveness of this repertoire, of this vocabulary, of this deep grammar of political struggle that was visible for many people, for many non-Indigenous people in North America, around the world, was visible on the public stage maybe for the first time, although it was really undergirded by a long infrastructure of political thought and practice, and that's part of the work of the book, is tracing that throughout the 20th century. So in unpacking what these protectors meant in calling themselves protectors, I observed two things that I saw in the meaning of that phrase. The first was that they rejected U.S. sovereignty as a product of colonial conquest and ongoing naturalized territorial occupation. The Ochechi-Shakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, is itself a sovereign nation with lands guaranteed by treaties that they had signed with the United States that date back to the 19th century, but that are still active treaties. The two primary treaties were in 1851 and 1868. And if you can see the little map I have here, the treaty lands were where the pipeline was going over. So the pipeline was technically off the reservation, but the lands designated as not having been ceded to the United States under the 1868 treaty were still well within those boundaries. So they argued that this violated their sovereignty. So in a sense, when they used the term protection in this sense, they meant protection of a jurisdictional order that was being violated, of course, is continually violated by the United States' assertion of its sovereignty over the land, water, and people. Now, the second thing that I came to realize in analyzing this phrase was that not only was there a refusal here, not only were they expressing a refusal of the sovereignty of the state as a form of colonial occupation, but they were also expressing a refusal of the very idea of sovereignty as a model of political authority, as that concept that sums up the kind of basic standard features of modern political rule. And the phrase that they used was one that was picked up by a number of activists, but is really very grounded in a longer history and a longer set of stories within the Lakota tradition. And that was Mini Wachoni, which means water is life. There are different ways of translating it. It can also be the water of life. And in this sense, the argument was not just that the US is unjustly imposing its sovereignty, and of course has unjustly imposed its sovereignty, but also that there are alternative models of political authority that are being erased by that act of imposing sovereignty. So here, in talking about water protectors, it wasn't just an alternative set of jurisdictional authorities, but rather a sense that Indigenous self-determination, in this case, Lakota self-determination, is about the protection and flourishing of interdependent relatives, including the other than human, water, plants, non-human animals, etc. So here, self-determination is expressed not as the rule of a human collectivity over an inert territory, but as the relationship of a human collectivity with the living beings of a territory. So one way of talking about this is self-determination as a kind of rule with rather than rule over, as a kind of not only a right, but a kind of set of responsibilities. So in starting with the No DAPL movement, I really came to have two motivations, two sort of tasks in writing the book. One was kind of more conceptual and political, and that's to develop and explore what I call political theories of Indigenous decolonization. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So these are projects that aim to address global white supremacy, empire, and especially settler colonial conquest by drawing on the political and ethical articulations of Indigenous societies themselves. So not only is this a question of contesting colonial power arrangements in the negative, pushing back against those, but it's also a question of that's about a kind of reconstruction of alternative vocabularies, alternative ways of thinking about self-determination that are not themselves simply the product of colonial power relationships, that have to do with the kind of dialogues and discourses going on within these societies themselves and among the thinkers I look at. And the key concepts here, and I'll focus on sovereignty primarily in my comments here, but the key concepts here are sovereignty, earthmaking, and what I call transnational internationalism. And I'm happy to sort of pick up on any of those threads in the Q&A. The second task was more sort of historical and exegetical, and that's to reconstruct insights and histories from some key figures and conceptual frameworks in Indigenous societies in North America. So these are thinkers who, in the discipline of Native American studies and Indigenous studies, have gotten their due in some ways, but in my own discipline of political science, especially Anglophone political science, but really political science anywhere, have not been treated with anything like the level of kind of care and depth that is required. So in the book, I focus on 6 main thinkers: Zikala Shah, who's Yankton, Dakota; Ella Deloria, who's Yankton, Dakota, a lot of Yankton, Dakota folks; Vine Deloria Jr., who's Yankton, Dakota, and there you see the picture of Ella Deloria there, who was Vine Deloria Jr.'s aunt, so they were related. George Manuel, who's Sekbokmumuk; Lee Markle, who's Stolo; and Howard Adams, who's a Métis scholar. So it's the book is not comprehensive, but I really try to go into a lot of depth on these different figures in the book. So to start with, in thinking about sovereignty, one of the major claims of the book is that we are accustomed to thinking about sovereignty as a modern political device that is a result of overcoming, to some degree, the legacies of colonialism and empire. That is to say, the modern sovereign state displaces previous modes of political rule that are more in line with notions of imperial hierarchy, colonization, and so on. And one of the major arguments, or at least the starting place of the book, is that this is not the right way of thinking about the concept of sovereignty and the practice of sovereignty. That sovereignty is deeply embedded in, and in certain respects, is an expression of practices of colonization, of colonial conquest in Western political thought. And this is both in the kind of institutions of sovereignty that we associate with the state, but also in the kind of deep conceptual understanding of, when political theorists in my field talk about sovereignty, what do we mean by that concept, right? What are the kind of key features of the concept? So central to the idea of sovereignty in Western political thought is the enforcement of violence within a particular territorial domain. The most famous definition of this comes from the German sociologist Max Weber. And this is through an unlimited collective will that is conceived of as separate and independent of others and rules over other collective or individual selves. So sovereignty specifically requires creating a social order within a bounded space, and that order is theoretically unlimited, undivided, and unaccountable. Right. So one of the features of sovereignty that is not as often remarked upon, but is really central to sovereignty as a colonial concept, is that sovereignty has to define its others, its outsides, as non-sovereign, and therefore legitimates the seizure of resources and territory from those marked as non-sovereign or even non-human. So in this sense, sovereignty did not replace colonialism, but in fact came to naturalize colonial practices of expansionism. So in my book, I argue that there is this relatively stable colonial core and expression of sovereignty in colonial forms of domination across different intellectual lineages and regime types. Now, one important implication of this is that, we may think that by democratizing sovereignty, by making it more of a popular exercise, that this would get rid of the colonial baggage that I'm attaching to it. At least in the context that I'm looking at in the United States, one of the core issues is that democratic sovereignty itself was conceptualized as an expansionist and colonial enterprise. So you see this very, very, very subtle image here. American Progress by John Gast, which was part of a series of engravings called The Spirit of the Frontier, with Colombia kind of hovering above the people moving west of the frontier, who are going to displace the indigenous peoples with their hunting practices, etc. And so here it's actually the democratic people themselves who are the vehicle of sovereign expansionism, rather than simply, this sort of hard power dimensions of the state. They're not really separable from one another. And so therefore, we see that sovereignty is colonial, even in these democratic articulations and iterations. So the response of the book to this kind of starting argument is to try to think about ways that indigenous anti-colonial thought, indigenous struggles in North America have sought to do what I call remapping sovereignty. That is, challenging different aspects of this colonial construction of sovereignty as basically an expansionist project that licenses the dispossession and seizure of indigenous lands and the sort of practices of what are essentially transnational practices of violence against Indigenous bodies and polities. So I argue here, and I sort of disentangle two ways I've thought about remapping sovereignty. And if you think back to that first slide on the no DAPL movement, this sort of roughly corresponds to the way that I was thinking about this notion of protection in the no DAPL movement. So one aspect of this, the first of these is what I call struggling over the terms of colonial sovereignty. And this idea results in the claim that decolonization and liberation means freedom for Indigenous peoples from the sovereign state. So it's not freedom necessarily to form a sovereign state, but freedom from the existing apparatus of the sovereign state. So in this respect, if we look at this at the international level, one of these core principles of international order is sovereign equality, the equality, or at least the formal equality of sovereign states. In fact, of course, sovereign states are unequal and there's material hierarchy, but the principle is one of formal equality. And in this respect, struggling over the terms of sovereignty means that the equality of peoples as a principle of international order must be distinguished from the equality of sovereign states. We cannot conflate the equality of states with the equality of peoples, because Indigenous peoples are oppressed by states who then naturalize themselves as the vehicle for collective self-determination, even as they are engaged with suppressing the collective self-determination of Indigenous peoples and stealing their lands and resources. So this aspect of the project requires a radical redistribution of the sites and sources of political authority. Sort of in the long horizon, it requires much more pluralistic systems of self-determination that might exist within, go beyond, and in some ways structurally negate or go against the supremacy of sovereign states to determine the conditions of political authority. A second mode that I disentangle of remapping sovereignty is a struggle over what I call the conceptual logics of sovereignty. So here, self-determination is not only moved down or up to different sites, it's not only redistributed, but it's reconceived as a relation of interdependent care for land and the earth, not an absolute will projecting dominion or domination over land. And this really deeply varies across different Indigenous traditions, depending on the community, the kinds of vocabularies that are used. So one of the goals of the book is really to try to bring out some of these important differences. But I also do try to synthesize some of the kind of way that these threads come together. So this is often expressed as a relation of kinship with the other than human, which generates reciprocal place-based duties through deep embeddedness in ecological networks. So self-determination here is not primarily the ability to project power over a territory. It's the capacity to, in a sense, care for a territory. So self-determination here becomes a right and a kind of duty to care with and for the earth. And in this sense, it's not something that is just a matter of human collectivities. It's a matter of relational networks that connect humans and the ecologies in which they're embedded. So even the kind of authority that comes out of self-determination is not fully authorized by humans. It's authorized in concert with an array of beings. And in my project, one of the ways I describe this as, or at least the sort of practice that this generates, is earth making, or trying to reconstruct and sort of make a world that is premised on these forms of self-determination, whether that's sort of in the interstices of colonial order, or whether that's sort of attempting to make a kind of full-blown institutional structural transformations. So here again, this challenges not only the distribution of sovereignty, sort of where sovereignty lies, who has sovereignty, but the very kind of logic of sovereignty as the proper expression of self-determination. And here I've included a picture of one of the important figures in the book, George Manuel, who wrote in 1974, is important Indigenous activist in Canada. He co-wrote this book, The Fourth World and Indian Reality, which talks about some of these questions in really interesting ways. This is the older edition. It was actually reissued in 2019, so it's very widely available now if you're interested in picking it up. So some kind of bottom lines of Remapping Sovereignty, of the kind of conceptual architecture of the book. So what I try to argue is that the traditions that I look at, the intellectual lineages I look at, generate a specific practice of indigenous decolonization against sovereignty. And this is both a struggle against the sovereignty of settler colonial states, a struggle against territorial occupation. And in the United States, that has a kind of very long durée, and often is naturalized, at least for the non-Indigenous population, in more subtle mechanisms of sort of the way that people experience the common sense of their surroundings. Of course, in the case of Israel-Palestine, we have this much more accelerated and much more directly militaristic form of displacement. Although even in the United States, even in particular moments, like the response to the no DAPL gatherings was state repression, was very much an attempt to criminalize the water protectors. It involved local police and sort of private security forces. So even there, we see particular moments where that sort of long-term naturalization of colonial sovereignty erupts when it's contested really head on in particular ways. So we see a kind of struggle against the sovereignty of the settler colonial state, and a struggle through and for this deeply relational grammar of self-determination as a kind of alternative to sovereignty and to the sovereign state. So now I'll just talk a little bit about one of these figures by way of trying to kind of connect up our different backgrounds and fields that we're approaching this topic from. And I want to talk here about Lee Marle, who unfortunately passed away in 2021 pretty recently. And if you're interested in her work, she was a widely known figure. So there's tons of videos on YouTube of her. So she's very easy to find. You don't even have to read anything. And she's an absolutely captivating speaker. So it's worth checking out if this is of interest. So Marle was an Indigenous Marxist and an Indigenous feminist. She was among the key activists in the Red Power movement of the late 1960s, which very much modeled itself on the Black Power movement in Canada. The United States was founded a little bit later in the form of the American Indian movement, which was then associated with the Red Power movement there. But this in Canada, this was founded a little bit earlier, and they were very attached to that. They kind of modeled themselves on the Black Panthers in some important ways. So she was an activist. She was a founder of a couple different important organizations, activist organizations, including the Native Alliance for Red Power and the Native Study Group, which was the Native Study Group was a group of Indigenous intellectuals, activists, thinkers who got together. There was one in Vancouver, Canada, one in San Francisco, who got together to read kind of the third world liberationist texts of the day. So they were reading Fanon, Mao, Lenin. They were reading Marx and Engels, sort of in order to try to understand both what was going on globally, but also trying to understand their specific situation and to conceptualize the form of colonization that they were facing. And so they were very tapped in and connected to these kind of wider networks of anti-colonial struggle at the sort of high point of the national liberation movements, and at a moment in particular where there was still very bloody and violent struggles against the kind of late colonial empire, so Portuguese colonialism, and of course South Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa, and so these sort of insurgencies and the counterinsurgent violence they unleashed were very present in their minds, in thinking about their own struggle and what to make of it. So she was a very profound critic of settler colonialism in Canada, and including the Canadian Communist Party and sort of the institutions of the organized left, the trade unions, et cetera, who really, aside from some select groups, were at this time very hostile, basically, to thinking of Indigenous peoples as, and especially their struggles for self-determination, as core to struggles for broader forms of social and political transformation. And so Marle, one of the things that Marle and others were looking at from the text they were reading was they were reading people like Fanon and seeing that self-determination and national liberation were absolutely central to understanding resistance to capitalism writ large, and to understanding the kind of actual structure, the class composition, if you will, of the globe, and that the white Canadian left was very provincial and parochial in that sense, and sort of having a very, very limited understanding of what constituted class struggle and class conflict. After her early years, she became a celebrated poet, novelist, playwright, incredibly prolific. She won every major, award in Canada, and her writings are really, really although they're not all of them are explicitly activist texts quite in the same way as her sort of personal activism was, they all are very much grounded in this background, in this setting of Indigenous struggles within broader global liberation struggles. In this context, she was also a longtime internationalist. She saw building relations of solidarity across national liberation movements, not only as sort of important for supporting others, but as really central to the development of critical consciousness among Indigenous peoples. That is to say, if connections could be built across different movements, that would itself contribute to denaturalizing, to ripping away the facade of, in her context, the Canadian settler state as the primary source of political authority, political loyalty and fidelity, citizenship, and so on, in her context. And so she saw these connections as not only ways of expressing solidarity and support for these other struggles, but as absolutely integral to actually constituting the collective self and the collective kind of consciousness of Indigenous peoples in this wider set of struggles. So I'll talk just briefly, and then I'll conclude about one particular article. And this is available. I believe it's republished on Marxist.org. So if you're interested in looking at it, it is available. It was written by Marle and Ray Bob in 1976. And Ray Bob was Marle's partner at that time. And it was published under a couple different titles in some different journals. One title, and I think both of the titles tell us a lot about what they were trying to do. One title was Natives Are Part of the Third World, really trying to connect the struggles in Canada to the Third Worldist project as a whole. And the other was Palestinians and Native people are brothers, trying to show that there was this intrinsic kinship between these struggles, that these should not be conceptualized as kind of separate struggles that were going on, halfway across the world, but that rather they were really integrally connected in important ways that that colonial sovereignty has a really vested interest in silencing those connections. So here is one, I think, really powerful quotation from Marle. She says, "The difference then between the oppressed peoples of the Third World as a whole and those of the internal colonies," by which she meant Indigenous peoples in North America, "is a quantitative matter related to the existence of the internal colony amid the concentrated power of the imperialist state machinery and the white settler populace that was massively aborted from Europe. It is not a matter of different goals, but of different strategies for achieving those goals." So she wanted to argue that these were connected situations of struggle, that in many ways, both due to the kind of analytic categories we use, the political experiences we're embedded in, and the different kinds of ideologies of settler colonialism itself had been artificially divided. And so here, what I think is important is that she isn't just sort of drawing a comparison or making an analogy between these struggles. She's saying that there are already deep transnational connections among settler colonial projects and counterinsurgency networks. And so even back in 1976, there were Indigenous activists who had a very acute awareness of it. It's much more common now, at least in the United States, it's much more common for Black, Indigenous, and sort of left activists in general to, point out the ways that Israeli security forces, local police departments here go to Israel. They're trained by Israeli security forces. And so the degree to which sort of settler colonial counterinsurgency is baked into American policing, it's almost like, it started, there was settler colonial in the United States, and now it's like it's almost circling back around to these networks that exist among surveillance and policing operations in Israel and the United States. But this was something that Miracle was already seeing at this point and was trying to point out, look, it's not just that we have these isolated situations. Like the people in power really already know the ways that they are connected and that we are connected. And here I think it's important to take the notion of the language of kinship that she was using seriously. Of course, kinship is always a metaphor. It's always a way of understanding of ourselves that's mediated through language. But she was very, I think, intentionally using this language to say that there are these transnational connections that we need to be aware of. And if we think of colonial sovereignty as really being a way of drawing boundaries between peoples and then enforcing those artificial boundaries so as to disconnect different sorts of struggles. If that's the condition that sovereignty kind of imposes, then one way of thinking about her appeal to kinship is to see her as rejecting what I call these anti-relational boundary drawing practices of colonial sovereignty. If sovereignty is about the expression of an undivided will within a particular territory, it requires the disavowal and the refusal of other sorts of relations, including and especially those among peoples who are whose existence is erased by the projection of sovereignty itself. So this is the main this is what I have to say in the presentation. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you all. One thing I wanted to mention that didn't make it into the presentation about Marle is she was an avid reader and a friend of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. She even composed a poem upon his passing that is entitled "Remembering Mahmoud Darwish," and so this was another way that she was really not just thinking about analogies or comparisons between these two situations, but really had this sense of affective, deep connection and affinities that kind of overflowed the boundaries that had been drawn, by the international system, by settler colonial states themselves, to kind of break up the possibilities of drawing these wider transnational connections. So that poem is also widely available online if you want to Google it. But so that's all I have for my comments. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll really look forward to chatting.
Thank you so much, David. That was a tour de force on this very complicated and oftentimes, marginalized set of events. I mean, this pipeline that you're speaking about had almost zero press coverage, right? And it was just going on in the background. Yeah, there was these kooky Native Americans complaining. Who cares about the treaties from 1851? They don't have any standing. This is America. We can do what we want. I mean, this is the general kind of position, and the consciousness, the lack of consciousness, and the misrepresentation of these sensitive issues that almost are tearing apart the world of indigenous peoples in the United States, are very similar to the kind of dismissals with which the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian pain is being dealt with in current ways. And in those ways, the ways in which these struggles are just trivialized by the media, even when they're covering them, right? So even when they're covering them, they're trivialized. It prevents people from really understanding what's going on. And I think your book, one of the great things that it does is, and I think a lot of comparative political theory, one of the things that it does well is it gives the context for non-specialists to kind of get into understanding the importance of the people and the ideas that it brings forward. And I think that your book does a great job of giving that context.
Thank you.
I want to begin by asking you about certain challenges that we have in anti-colonial thought, right? So one of the ways that we think about the anti-colonial struggle, especially in this part of the world, is a struggle against colonialism in which the success story ends up with a nation state, right? And that obviously that nation state was never meant to replicate a European nation state, but it is undeniable that what comes out of colonialism is or what was an aspirational part of colonialism was the creation of these free nation states. But what I see you saying in is that if we pay close attention to Native American thinkers, they're telling us that, look, it's not making a nation state that is the ultimate goal. There's something else that is possible. So could you please contextualize for us, how do we imagine something else when we're so fixated, first of all, on creating a nation state? What's the genesis of that desire, number one? And number two is, and then protecting the nation state becomes the post-colonial dilemma, because you get the nation state and then you realize that, yeah, well, you got the nation state, but we're still not, free in any kind of substantial sense. Then there's all this struggle to try to protect the nation state. But the voices that you're profiling and the voices are calling from Turtle Island are basically saying, look, maybe we should try something different.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question, and a very difficult one at that. So one reason that I think that the figures that I look at are important is not only in pulling out the different contexts that they're working in, but rather in appreciating the distinctive role of the state in their theories and experiences. That is to say, it's a bit easier to see how the nation state is a problem, is less a kind of obvious vehicle for liberation in contexts where the nation state is basically a result of this massive demographic engineering project that's displaced the indigenous peoples from the land, made them a minority in their own homelands, and sort of created a political architecture where it's very, very difficult to sustain even relatively modest forms of representation within that state. I think there are interesting commonalities between some of the anti-colonial movements, and particularly figures within the anti-colonial movements around the world who were cognizant that the nation state was not the goal, not the endpoint, but one tool among others, one pathway among others, if you like. And so I think it's not surprising that so someone like Marle was turning to a figure like Fanon. Of course, many people throughout the world, and Latin America and North America, all over, were reading Fanon very closely. But I think it's not surprising that someone like her would turn to Fanon, because he was so acutely aware of, what he called, the pitfalls of national consciousness, and the ways that you could have the construction of a new nation state that would then come to consolidate its own interests and consolidate the interests of elites who would then go on to in effect kind of capture the more popular dimensions, the more popular spirit of the anti-colonial movements in the name of state formation. I think another key kind of dimension of this is, and it relates to some of what I was talking about with Marle, is these international connections, efforts to build different sorts of regional federations, efforts to build transnational connections that went beyond beyond the nation state, that tried to kind of, in some sense, pool sovereignty or sort of gather sovereignty in larger supranational entities. Of course, I'm no expert, but Pan-Arabism is certainly one inflection of this. Pan-Africanism, led by people like Kwame Nkrumah, is one important part of this. There was a version of this in efforts to build a regional federation in the Caribbean. And then you see this, although it's not usually talked about in these terms, but you see this in my context with Indigenous peoples in the Americas who were forming these different kinds of federations, really among smaller communities who were then pooling their resources and coming together and at the very least trying to form larger advocacy bodies that could make a dent in state policies that had been colonial in nature. So I think one of the connections that is really interesting to make here is that even within the kind of broader scope of global anti-colonial thought, there were some resources that Indigenous thinkers were borrowing from that were, if not anti-statist, at the very least, cognizant of some of the limitations that could come with the assumption of state power once the national liberation struggle was formally won. Now, I think for in ongoing colonial contexts, and just to speak to your earlier comments, the degree of erasure and dehumanization of people who are still, in effect, formally colonized is so profound, so deep, so violent that, I feel that it's almost sort of skipping steps to have this critique of the nation state, right? If you don't have a vehicle for expressing power in some way, then anything looks better than that, right? And
on that note,
yeah,
sorry to cut you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Note,
Yeah,
I mean, you arrived at a place where I guess I wanted to begin with, which was that sovereignty and self-determination, right, were such a key part of the anti-colonial struggle.
Yeah.
And like you said, when you're completely dispossessed, one thing that I find resonance with Native American political thought, I mean, I've had very limited, and after this talk, and the figures and the books that you've indexed here, I think I'm going to spend some time going back over it, and I thank you for that. But one thing from a distance, which I have respected, when I've appreciated Native American thought, is basically this idea of talking about sovereignty in a time when kind of like, postmodern leftists in America were completely dismissing sovereignty as even a thing that we should be aspiring for. And in that sense, I see a lot of resonance between them and what happens in Asia and African countries and in Western Asia, because the question of sovereignty is very alive, and the idea of territoriality and land is so alive. I mean, that's what we see in front of our eyes in Palestine. And when you look at critical thinking in America, it almost seemed as though everybody had dismissed sovereignty, except for Native American political thought, where the idea of sovereignty was very alive. But when I read your book, it was almost as though this what a 20th century desire for self-determination on land and sovereignty was being reworked in a way that I felt like I felt it like slipping through my hands, you know, it was like sand slipping through my hands, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
could you maybe make a comment on that? And then I'm going to let Dr. Sami jump in.
Yeah.
He wanted to also jump in and engage you for a second. So
Great. No, that's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're pointing to is really it's one of the central tensions in the book, and it's also a tension within the thinkers that I'm, trying to whose thought I'm trying to unpack, because I mean, I think you're right that the discourse of sovereignty is the central plank of Native American, of indigenous political thought. And the reason for that in many ways is that it is a fundamental way of rejecting erasure. It is a fundamental way of asserting, not only presence, not only humanity, but also polity. That is to say, we're not only here as people, but we are here as people with our own modes of governance, with our own way of relating to the wider world. And that is...
And to the earth, right?
And to the earth, yes. And so, one of the ways that, and there are tensions here with the wider decolonization project, precisely because of the empirical outcomes you're talking about. What we've seen both in North America, but also in the post-colonial world is, we've seen repression of some of these minority populations who've come to articulate their identity as Indigenous. And so there is a real tension here in how not only the location of self-determination, but who gets to affirm their existence as those who are capable of having the power to govern, and actualizing and actually realizing that power. One of the ways that I've tried to, because one of the arguments that I don't want to make, or one of the implications that I don't want to make, is to suggest that, when I talk about this notion of self-determination as a form of care, I don't want to say that this isn't about power, right? It certainly is about power, but it is a power that is conceptualized and exercised and, in a sense, forged through these place-based responsibilities, through these place-based duties. And so these are collectives that, in some sense, deserve to be recognized as the governors of their own territories. And so that dimension of sovereignty, I think, remains important, and that resonance with the wider, importance of sovereignty and land in an international system, which is completely prevalent still on various forms of colonial and neo-colonial hierarchies and inequalities, still remains central. But at the same time, there is, one of the points I want to make is there is, within these traditions, there's a reworking of what that sovereignty means, what kinds of social and political transformations that entails, that has this deep component of ecological embeddedness and stewardship of the earth at its core. And that also requires self-defense, self-protection against colonial invasion, against ongoing colonial invasion. So it is still a matter of power. Yeah.
David, I'm going to let Dr. Sami, just for the sake of time, jump in. Dr. Sami is the director of our institute, and he himself is part of the Palestinian struggle for many years.
Yeah.
Dr. Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Awais. And thank you, David. Thank you, Dr. Temin, for being with us and for joining us and for your presentation. Very enlightening. And I hope actually that you would join us in the future to go further into the history of the indigenous people struggle in North America.
Yes, I'd love to. Yeah.
Let me. I have few questions and a few comments. I'll try to be brief and try to be pointed. If you can tell us briefly, and I'm going to go over them, and then I'm going to get you to comment on it. Where's Turtle Island? Where does it come from? I mean, it's an interesting name. I would love to know what the history of it is, so maybe we can use it if that's something that there is a consensus on using it. But when we look at the indigenous people struggle in North America as any other settler colonialist struggle, certainly there are some successes and failures. The white man, those who invaded America and were able to take over, were very successful in taking over and basically marginalizing and exterminating, for the most part, the indigenous people. We can say about Australia, New Zealand, even Latin America. There were other experiments where they failed, like Algeria, when the French tried them, even though they were there for over 130 years, and also parts of Africa. So I was wondering if you could tell us from your studies, at what point you could say that this is a successful or unsuccessful struggle, and what would be the delineating lines by which you say at this point the indigenous people really lost the struggle, because you can look back almost 400 years of struggle and you could say, okay, at this point we really lost it, and why do you think that happened? Briefly, because I think this probably would call for a full presentation. And secondly, when we look at the current struggle for indigenous people, I spent a lot of time in the US, and I've had friends with the American Indian movement and others, and they did join us when we were fighting secret evidence. They were one of the groups that were with us in that struggle, showing moral support. What is today's struggle for the indigenous people? What exactly are they trying to accomplish? I mean, we know they are probably around less than perhaps 0.5% of the population or less. What are they trying to accomplish? What would be how would we define their struggle? Or is it just a historical struggle now with some local demands or things of that sort? And do you think if you have definitive objectives, whether they're political or otherwise, self-determination, sovereignty, or however you want to put it, do you think you can attain these objectives peacefully? And how does that happen within the structure that was built through the American experiment? And my last point, which has to do about the parallel between struggles, and here I'm talking specifically about in the Palestinian context. What we're facing today is different. That's what most people do not understand. That at one point, most of these settler colonialist movements, they have their own discourse, which was, for the large part, a lot of it was racist, but over time, they tried to ameliorate that and tried to present, once they had it, in a more, in a softer way, in more inclusive way, the right to vote and the right to get there, but they are there, because they attained the majority, and for the most part, they were able to guarantee that they would stay there. In the Palestinian context, this is, of course, we're facing with Zionism, a supremacist, racist ideology that it's very difficult to see how they can square this circle, or at least, because once they do that's be the end of Zionism as an ideology, because this is not just a nation that is coming to take over another nation or a race coming. This is more of an ideology that is rooted into this supremacist way that once it's taken out of that ideology, the ideology is done. And at the same time, they can never reach. You're going to basically fragment the whole region. So the region is no longer Arabs, but it's Alawites and Shiites and Druzes and Egyptians and even within the Egyptians, Egyptian Copts, which is basically what they always aspire to have, to make this region not into countries, but even further fragment the countries, even within Sudan, South Sudan, North Sudan, Darfur, this and that, because this is how they can maintain their status. So having said that, there are a lot to be learned. Obviously, I want to hear from the experiment of other colonialist movements, but in the Palestinian context, there doesn't seem to be the end game by which they can actually live without having to have a military superiority forever.
Mhm.
Once they lose military superiority, that would be the end of Zionism and a Zionist state, which I don't see how this could happen forever. There's no one stays strong military forever. So do you have any thoughts on that? Have you thought about this? And even from the scholar you were citing, what's her name? Laka? What the person?
Lee Markle, yeah.
Yes. So Lee Markle. So maybe she's thought about it. I do not know, but because when you discuss with the people who actually know the struggle, they conclude the same. But those who don't, they try to start thinking in different ways. This two-state, one state, but that actually sidesteps the main problems within the ideology of Zionism. Let me stop here and try to get you the floor. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I mean, I'll start there. I think you're absolutely right that the problem is one of asymmetric power. And that is consolidated and expressed through a military occupation and through supremacist ideology. And in many ways, the way that I see the US project is, as you say, it's an incredibly successful eliminationist project over this long durée of 400, 500 years of territorial occupation. At the same time, I would say that the demands that are being put forward by Indigenous movements are the restoration of their sovereignty, their self-determination, and to get many of their lands back. Now, over the last 50 years, of course, there's a utopian dimension to that. But over the last 50 years, there have been many piecemeal efforts, whether it's using the American sort of elements of the American legal system to sort of bring lands back to communities, and also working to some degree with non-Indigenous peoples who are in solidarity, who are supporters, who recognize, themselves as part of a settler colonial project to return lands in various places. So I think it's on the one hand, it's true that, assessing the criteria by which the struggle would be won is very difficult in such a circumstance, because colonization is so complete, so violent that there isn't this is not Algeria. There isn't a way of implementing an Algerian model where the settlers just go home. And so then in many ways, the question becomes, on whose terms do we live? And part of the argument of the book is that, for me, at least, as someone who is non-Indigenous, we settlers have to begin to at least try to live as guests on terms that are respectful of Indigenous sovereignty and on terms that are respectful of the land. And that means, in many ways, giving back a lot of the land, I think. And so, that's at least one element. The struggle today both has that dimension of demands for the return of land, the return of sacred places that have been dispossessed. There's also a lot of, rearguard action, I would say. In the past period of the Supreme Court, a case came before the Supreme Court that was challenging the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was a piece of legislation which basically tried to prevent non-Indigenous child welfare authorities from taking Indigenous children from their families and extended families. And this came under challenge in the Supreme Court. And this is, a very piecemeal piece of reform. In itself, it's not enough, but it is also something that's being attacked. And so even the kind of fragile legal edifice that exists for some measures of limited self-determination or limited protections are themselves, still under challenge. So there are many ways in which the present day struggles are both, against consolidating gains that are important, but perhaps, not revolutionary, but also seeking to make these longer term transformations possible. So that's kind of what I see, is that both of those things are going on. Let's see. I'll briefly speak to your question on Turtle Island. It's kind of an overlap between different people's creation stories. And that's one of the reasons why this term has sort of caught on. It's an overlap between the creation stories of Anishinaabe people who are in my region, in the kind of Great Lakes region, going into Ontario, Canada, and down through Michigan and the sort of Midwest of the United States. And it's also part of the creation story of the Haudenosaunee people who that's the Iroquois Confederacy in kind of New York, that entire area of the region that's now known as the Hudson Valley. And so it's a term that's caught on over the last 20 years or so, as a way of, like many of these efforts at the symbolic level, as a way of recognizing that the United States is not a nation in many ways, but a colonized space made up of this plurality of nations who have these much longer shared traditions and who have these much longer origins in the land, and who think of the land on very, very different terms than the U.S. project does. So I think in this vein there are many ways of expressing a kind of what you might call a kind of symbolic insurgency through terms like these. But there are also efforts, to really get the land back. And I do think that is sort of still very, very core to the present day project, and still is at, that question of self-determination is still very key, despite the very difficult circumstances under which that's undertaken.
So that getting the land back would mean winning a number of court cases. Is that how is this thought of in terms by Indigenous people? Is this thought in terms of like a private property or a treaty, like law? What's the pathway here? Because we're not going to have like so what's the pathway? Is it through the legal system, basically?
So I think that's one dimension, and it's certainly the case that there in cases where there are treaties. So there have been cases that have been won that have either resulted in the repatriation of land, or resulted in certain communities having treaty rights that allows them to practice their traditional economic activities on territory that was effectively that was unceded, but then was taken over by American settlers over a long period of time. And so there are some legal dimensions to it, and certainly there are just a cohort of Indigenous and non-Indigenous lawyers who have tried to build up the edifice to be able to do that in this more reform-oriented fashion. I think there's also the possibility of armed struggle is very unlikely, in this context. It's just not really on the table. But there are people who are involved, nevertheless, in various forms of direct action. And that was, the No DAPL movement was both the case was going through the courts, at various levels. They had, lawyers were working on it at the same time as they were trying to bring attention to it, on the ground and putting their bodies in the way of bulldozers and all that. And so I think
could there be a political settlement?
Yeah.
Could there be a kind of political settlement in which instead of a legal course, but allies of indigenous peoples gather together and make a political case in which, not through the courts, but through maybe an amendment or legislatures, there could be a rightful place of indigenous claims within the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean,
has that worked? I know that there was a referendum in Australia recently, which failed.
Yeah, which failed. Yes. Yeah. There is some I mean, one of the things that's distinctive about the United States is there is in the Constitution, there is a recognition of the status of indigenous peoples in the Commerce Clause. It's sort of one of the strange, results of history that this is something that indigenous lawyers have been able to draw on in order to ground the recognition of their rights in the American Constitution, which, as a project, in reality was, over the long term dedicated to their elimination. But I do think there are, I don't think the prospects for a political settlement in that sense are very likely, but I do think there are, projects, especially at the local level, of people getting together and transferring land back. Especially, I mean, there's a huge, the national parks here cover this massive, massive territory. It's all public lands. And I think one promising vehicle, and some have advocated for this, is putting all of the national parks under the custodianship of indigenous societies, indigenous tribes. And so that's one vehicle where, I think that is both practically possible and would be deeply meaningful, and also would be a huge step towards, undoing some of these historical and ongoing forms of violence. But I don't think there's not going to be a magic bullet by any stretch of the imagination. But, I would say one of the my real investments in the book, was that we're all facing, the climate crisis. And if we're serious about actually addressing the climate crisis, then these forms of thought and really the projects of decolonization are not just for indigenous peoples, right? There's something that's non-indigenous peoples too need to get on board with, at the risk of, our civilization basically killing itself. And so I think in many ways that motivation, of saying like, look, these are forms of thought and forms of social life that are just absolutely indispensable to the future of humanity.
Can I, because we have a few more minutes, I don't want to keep you too long.
Of course. Yeah.
I want to jump in here, and because you raised this issue, and it was an issue that I wanted to talk about, because it ties also into Palestine, which is the idea of sacred land. I mean, so one of the, I was in Syracuse for a while, and the Haudenosaunee there was a lake, Syracuse Lake, which was purportedly the most polluted lake, and that was the the site at which the Haudenosaunee got the law, this the way of life that they abide by was given to them by the lawgiver at the banks of that lake. And that lake was, which was a sacred site. And one of the struggles of the Palestinian is the issue. What complicates is this idea of sacredness, the sacred land. It's a sacred land for many of those who are contesting that area. And you mentioned in your talk about this idea of recalculating the position of self-determination and the other than human, is how you. And in this case, sacred land for the indigenous people of North America is the other than human, which they would like to bring into a balance with the claims of self-determination. In Islamic political thought, there's an intuitive other than human that balances claims to secular self-determination. So I don't know, these parallels, is there ways of thinking about sacredness and religious piety and making room for that in the idea of a secular nation state, which indigenous people can help us to rethink how to balance, transcendent claims on us. And here I'm not just talking about God, but also talking about the idea of prophecy, for instance, and the land itself as being sacred. How can indigenous people help us to think about that in our context?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I wish I had more capacity to clearly draw the links to the context of Islamic political thought and Islamic theology in a way that would be satisfying. I mean, one thing I can say that speaks to the argument of the book is that the idea of sacred lands, I think, is often thought of as lands that are exclusive to a single people. That is to say that because it's a matter of religious piety and duty, or in the case of the Haudenosaunee, it's a matter of this is where their people originated from. It's this place. So this place is sacred. And I think at a fundamental level, sovereignty discourse is about saying, only we have the authority to be here and everybody else is not legitimate here. And what's interesting about many of those sacred places, at least in some places I know in the United States, is that they're shared by a number of different peoples. I mean, even the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is a confederacy of different peoples who are not always aligned with one another, even though they, have these historical governance structures by which they've come into an alliance since at least the 12th century. And so the idea, that these are not exclusive sovereignty claims or exclusive property claims, but rather that these relationships can themselves be open to multiple parties, I think is really central to that notion that self-determination is relational. Yeah.
When you're talking about the Haudenosaunee, I mean, their claim isn't that, look, this is a sacred land that belongs only to us, but it's kind of like we all should share in protecting and safeguarding this place. In fact, it was the settlers who had this idea of possession and use and control and dominion, which the Haudenosaunee didn't want. That wasn't their position. They said this land is sacred, therefore we all need to be caretakers of this land. And it was the settlers who had this idea of private property, kind of really liberal understanding of how they should deal with the land.
Yeah, and in a way that was, I mean, what Indigenous peoples like the Haudenosaunee have had to do, kind of juridically speaking, is to kind of force their claims into that language, and even to force their understanding of their relationship to the land, in terms of, you know, monotheism, and especially Christianity, and this idea that, you know, the only relationship one can have to land is its inscription as a form of property, right? As an extension of the will, the unlimited will of an individual or a group of ownership. And so those possibilities have both been constrained by the kinds of languages that people like the Haudenosaunee have been forced to use, even at the same time as, you know, I'm indicating with this some of these kind of more capacious notions of self-determination, as there are much wider understandings of the possibilities of relating to land and relating to other peoples through these notions of, you know, stewardship and kind of shared authority over a space that doesn't need to collapse into, you know, military or some other form of supremacy over a space.
Thank you so much, David. Really, this was a very important discussion because it really speaks to the different ways far off lands, far off peoples have been facing the same struggle. And I hope this is a longer conversation between us about trying to connect these people who in the past have recognized each other's struggles, but, you know, on an institutional level, you know, and as a collective of people working in political theory and political science, I think, you know, interconnecting in this way will help us to delve deeper in some of the things that, I mean, Dr. Sami brought up. So I'm really happy and really touched by the fact that you responded, even on a short notice, to our invitation. And I know that probably took time out of your schedule. And you're always welcome in Istanbul. And you know, I invite, you know, you to maybe the second book could be to draw out these in more detail, you know, the global implications of Native American thought for struggles like Palestine, you know, how we could use that experience and that know-how to help these kinds of entrenched problems that we see right now. So thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was such a pleasure and an honor to be with you all, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much.